Okay, so hi everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and depending on your time zone. My name is Nicola Piras, and this is the fifth Culinary Mind Colloquium organized by Culinary Mind. And so, sorry. Okay. This series is part of the activities of Culinary Mind, a leading international center promoting philosophical thinking on food. And this series is organized by Andrea Borghini, Megan Dean, Beatrice Cerini, and Nicola Piras. The series aims to highlight new work on philosophical issues that pertain to food and eating practices, to spark discussion and debate, and to connect scholars working in this area. If you want to retrieve videos of our past events, you can visit our webpage, section media. If you want to stay up to date to the news on Culinary Mind, please subscribe to our mailing list on our webpage or text us. Now, it's a pleasure for me to introduce you Gabriella Petrick from the University of Stavanger in Norway. Gabriella received her PhD from the University of Delaware, and she's currently a EU Horizon 2020 Marie Curie at the University of Stavanger in Norway. Her interdisciplinary research on food combines the fields of the history of technology, sensory history, environmental history, and the history of science. Additionally, Gabriella Petrick's training at the Culinary Institute of America at Cornell University and at several wineries in Napa and in Sonoma counties has shaped her theoretical approach to the history of taste. Her first book project, entitled Industrializing Taste, Food Processing and the Transformation of the American Diet, 1900-1965, analyzes how new food processing techniques transformed the foods available to American consumers, as well as how housewives incorporated these new industrial foods into their family's diet over the course of the last century. She's also finishing a second book project, Sweet, Sour, Salty, Bitter, Taste and History, for the Sensory History series at the University of Illinois Press. Her new projects looks at globalization of wine in the late 20th century and early 21st century, and how scientific inquiry and technological innovations have changed the taste of wine in the glass. She has won many awards for her scholarship, and she has taught in many different universities, among which NYU, George Mason, and Boston University. She has published in many journals, among which the Journal of American History, and she has appeared on the History Channel, the Food Network, and NPR. The title of her talk today is Making Bordeaux Modern, the Bordelaise wine industry after World War II. And so, Gabriella, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thanks so much. So I'm just going to share my screen. And I will make that big. All right, so we're a small group, so we can keep this a little bit. I have a little bit of a more formal reading part, but then I also have, we can make a little bit more informal. I will frame this, this is my Marie Curie project on the globalization of the wine industry in the age of climate change. And so I'm focusing on California, Bordeaux, a comparative analysis in Italy, and some new wine districts. I'm envisioning a section on Virginia and China and England, and then something else. I'm not quite sure. So this is sort of me working through the research that I was finally able to do late last fall and earlier this spring, but there's still a lot of work I need to do. And so this is sort of my first blush. So forgive me if I'm a little wonky or a little off. So I really look forward to your feedbacks and your thoughts on this. After Lionel Cruz, who was arrested for fraud in the fall of 1913, he quipped defiantly, "They're talking about Winegate. I will be the Nixon of Bordeaux. You'll see." Little did he know that both he and Richard Nixon would suffer similar disgraceful fates. The story of Winegate started more than a year earlier when on June 28, 1973, tax and fraud inspectors attempted to enter the Cruz's warehouse, Cruz et Filles et Frères, in the Chartrons district of Bordeaux. Lionel and his cousin Yvonne, Pierre Bert, a wine negotiant, and 15 others were indicted on fraud charges. Maison Cruz was a very prominent negociant, which made the whole sordid affair even more explosive. It came through a couple different names: Winegate, L'Affaire de Bordeaux, Scandale de Bordeaux. But it was not just simply a Bordeaux story. This was a global story about fraud and what Bordeaux should taste like. The house was founded in 1819 by Herman Cruz, a Danish-German merchant who emigrated to the area, likely to take advantage of the bustling port of Bordeaux, something that had been, the port of Bordeaux has been bustling since basically the Roman period. A wide array, not just of wine, but a wide array of products, and including some slave ships. In Bordeaux at the time, most winemakers purchased their grapes from small vignerons, wine grape growers, who produced grapes on 5 to 6 hectares. Houses like the Cruz's used hundreds of different vignerons to produce their wines. Buyers like Pierre Bert were an essential link between growers and producers when grapes or wine was scarce, as it was in 1972 and 1973. Bert created an elaborate plan to sell wine from the Midi, a southwestern district with lesser wines, as Bordeaux, or in this case, as in Left Bank Bordeaux, which I'll explain a little bit more in a couple of slides. He worked under the cover of Sergei Balan, a small wine merchant who could mint the tax stamps that Bert needed to create his fraud. Because Bert was known as a cheat, not just in Bordeaux, but throughout the state of Gironde, he was suspect, and so he needed someone like Balan to cover his fraud. Sud-Est, the local paper, reported on the trial. And this is my rough translation from the paper that you're looking at. The reporter said, "First of all, Pierre Bert tells us about his past as a wine merchant, his descent from Barsac, which produces sweet wine, to Bordeaux in order to cover his financial difficulties. He was in deep to the state for tax fraud. His work as a courtier and then a commissaire. He was a jack of all trades and yet never quite clean. He gave the impression," the reporter says, "he gave the impression that he was directing the interrogation and not bothering with formality throughout the trial." Bert said, "I'm guilty, but out of the 1.5 million hectoliters of red wine controlled by AOC, which is the Appellation Contrôle d'Origine, which set very strict limits and regulations about how wine was produced in Bordeaux, there are but 700,000 to 800,000 that are magnificent, but the rest are just small Bordeaux wines, modest, nice products that cannot be presented as they are, especially abroad. So we have to cook some of the wines. And who does this? The owners, the merchants, because it's extremely difficult to comply with the law, which is true of both parties. As a trader, I've seen frauds everywhere, whether they're from the traders who are from here or those who are not. It is a hypocrisy to see the union of negociants, a syndicate that controlled people like Cruz who banded together to be able to export and sell wine, not only abroad, but also within France. And they bought wine, they bought grapes, they made wine. It is true that I am guilty, Bert continued, but I am not the one who caused the fraud. There are thousands of guilty parties with me. He then he then has as his formula for claret. So because Bordeaux wine is a blend of grapes, he had a formula, and he called it a baptism, in which wine traders throughout the region actually practiced fraud to make the wines taste better than they actually were. He said it was normal, as he told the judge. In the meantime, he added, it was not possible that some of my colleagues had, it was not impossible that some of my colleagues had experienced fraud. It was Mr. Gardia, the divisional inspector of fraud control, a very fine man, who told me that. In the audience were all smiles, the reporter wrote. When it came to thinking about the Cruises, who were much a part of this fraud that, as Bert was, Monsieur Lionel Cruz said, I had no reason to suspect Bert. He says, there were many Bordeaux merchants in that situation. His situation is that the 1970 and 71 releases were in short supply, and he had made contracts that he needed to fulfill. So Cruz was desperate to find wine to fulfill those contracts for sale abroad. But there's another issue that's important to think about. It's also, what was the taste of the wine? When asked about this, Cruz said, it is not to denigrate the Bordeaux. It is to say that there are excellent table wines in France. I do not want to be the grave digger of the wine of Bordeaux, but yes, dare I say it, there's confusion on his part. And especially when the wines are young and arrive in a taker, as they did with the contracts Bert had set up with wine from the Midi to become Bordelaise wine. Cruz explains that he could not tell that the wine was not one of the finest vintages in Bordeaux in more than 2 decades. But he got off because the judge bought the story that he couldn't possibly tell these young wines were not one of the finest vintages. But Bert, unlike Cruz, got a year in jail, and both got significant fines. But on appeal, both basically got let off the hook, even as Bert only served part of his sentence. So one of the lessons, this is a New York Times article from 1974, just after the trial. What I want to extract from this article is the very difficult ways it was to talk about what a Bordelaise wine or a good Bordeaux should taste like. So in this article, it says, what's more, the Cruz trial showed that even experts can be fooled, like the Cruzes, by young wine. No one in France was willing to testify under oath that he or she could really distinguish among the several young nondescript wines. Quality wines are another matter. All the same, a lot of the people should feel a lot more confident when buying wine or ordering wine, knowing that the professionals don't always know well either, or at least that's what they say. This is very bad for everyone, Harry G. Sileris, president of the California Wine Institute, had to say about this, had to say about the Bordeaux events. This sort of thing is bad for them, and it's bad for us too, because perhaps it will convince some people that just because a product is French or foreign, it is better. That was a constant problem at the time in the US wine market. People prized European wines over Native American wines, particularly California wines. Of course, there's always a chance that cheaper French wines, the ones allegedly involved in the scandal, will be better. Not better than California wines, but better than they were when they were being mixed with who knows what. In this case, often white, more acidic white wines to make them more dynamic. It's also good for the small merchant, said Stephen Spurrier, who I'll say more about later, an Englishman who runs a wine store in Paris, because the scandal has put everyone in a panic. Quoted in the Times of London recently, Mr. Spurrier said he anticipating getting much better wine now from Bordeaux. In the past year, he said, I sent back 4,000 to 5,000 bottles of Bordeaux wine because it's been switched and wasn't the wine that I ordered a year ago. In other words, he got a lot of fraudulent wine to sell as claret. In some cases, when you put them up, they simply say, okay, pay half the price, Mr. Spurrier said, indicating that most people were actually in on the fraud. Okay, so I need to take a little bit of a step back and look at the a map. So to understand Bordeaux, there are two major wine grapes, which I'll talk about in a minute, but there is the left bank of Bordeaux, which is Medoc, Pauillac, Saint-Estèphe, Pauillac, Saint-Julien. There's Haute Medoc and Medoc. And on the left side of the bank, the Cabernet Sauvignon grape is dominant, although they do grow Cabernet Franc, a little bit of Carmenere, a little bit of Petit Verdot, and a fair amount of Cabernet Franc. The Graves area, which I'm not talking about white wines today, but Bordeaux produces both red and white grapes. And the whites are both sweet and dry, but I'm not going to get into that because I don't have enough time. But then you have the right bank, which is the areas of Pomerol, Saint-Emilion, of Blaye, of Côte de Bourg, in which the Merlot grape or the Cabernet Franc grape is produced more than Cabernet Sauvignon. So these two different wine areas, one that is gravel, and then one left bank is gravel and right bank is clay, they produce wines that taste differently, even though it's the same grapes. So it all becomes a bit of a muddle about how one thinks about what the taste of Bordeaux ought to be. All right, so I think it's, I would like to take a moment to just talk about the grapes. So this is what I'm calling the king of grapes, Cabernet Sauvignon. So if we look at this image, one of the things we can tell, it's a blue-black grape, so it has a lot of pigment to it. It's also a very tight cluster of grapes. So it's grown in many, many different places, Bordeaux, Tuscany, Sonoma, Napa, Australia. The ideal soil is gravel, which is indicative of the left bank, what the geology is. It's hard to grow. It can be very underripe. It's susceptible to a number of different diseases. It ripens relatively late compared to Merlot, which we'll look at next. But if we look at sort of wine characteristics, general, it's dense, it's dark, it's tannic. And when I say tannic, it's like if you drink really over extracted tea, it's what grips in your teeth. It's a protein that dries things out. It also displays different flavor profiles depending on what the climate is. So in a cool climate like Bordeaux, it's vegetal, bell pepper, asparagus. In a medium climate, it's mint, black pepper, eucalyptus, which is more like California. If it's a hot climate, it's more jammy. Cooked fruit, think about strawberry jam, raspberry jam, and whether one likes that or not matters quite a bit. The what I'll call the rising prince of Merlot. It also grows in very similar climates. The left bank, or sorry, the right bank of Saint-Emilion and Pomerol, it likes clay, unlike Cabernet Sauvignon, which does not like clay because it gets wet feet and the roots rot. Merlot actually quite likes that. So it has much fewer tannins. It has different characteristics of strawberry, red fruit, cedar, tobacco in cool climates like Bordeaux. Medium climates, blackberry, black cherry, what we call red fruits. Hot climates, fruitcake, chocolate. I'm not sure I agree with that, but people have different palates, but you get a much more cooked perspective on it. So 2 years before Winegate broke, there was a very different spectacle in the streets of Bordeaux. On Sunday, June 27th, 1971, police on motorcycles cleared the way for more than 3,000 people to parade down the l'Esplanade de Quinconce in the heart of Bordeaux in celebration of La Réhabilitation du Vin. Majorettes and military bands were followed by the various wine syndicates who donned their medieval velvet robes and mitred hats. Each group carried a banner with an insignia symbolizing their contribution to the Bordeaux wine industry. The 1,200-meter long parade ended at a stadium filled with more than 25,000 people, where artists and folk troupes entertained them into the night. There was even an opera entitled Bacchus Triomphant and fireworks over the lake. Few Bordelaise could remember anything like this weekend because the last wine festival was in 1909, well before the two world wars that decimated the area. The festival was intended to finally bring quality and quantity together after the devastation of the vineyards during the Second World War, and then almost 2 decades of terrible vintages, including a vine-destroying freeze in 1954, and only 3 good years in the 1960s. The parade and festival illustrate the hope of a new beginning for Bordeaux wines on the world market. The Interprofessional Council on the Wines de Bordeaux, CIBV, organized the event over the previous 9 months, modeling it on Munich's Oktoberfest beer festival. In organizing the festival, the CIBV wanted to do more than just promote wine. Bordeaux wines were already world famous among connoisseurs, especially the Belgians and Great Britain. But it was the very lucrative American market that Bordeaux exporters had their eye on. That Bordeaux wines needed to be rehabilitated had everything to do with what Bordeaux or Medoc or Graves or Saint-Emilion or Pomerol should taste like, as New World wines, particularly Bordeaux blends and varietals, especially Cabernet Sauvignon and Merlot in California, but also in Australia, South Africa, Chile, and Argentina. There was competition to be had for what the characteristics of wine should be like. So this is a bit my less formal part. So what should Bordeaux wines taste like? I'm sort of a little bit ahead of myself. So in the archive, this is sort of an abbreviated front and back of how I know there were majorettes and how I know there were police escorts and how I know how many people there were and how many long lines, how many people were participating and how long the parade actually was. So this goes over 5 separate pages listing everybody and the number of participants in each section that went into that parade. That how I think about, what were they wearing? These are images that come from promotional materials showing this, calling back to the Middle Ages about what the glory of Bordeaux wine ought to be, even though in reality, it really quite never was. But so what should it be like? So in the 1960s, the CIBV had contracts with people in the United States, but they organized wine tastings across the United States. And this is but one in 1961. And so this is Fernanda Garcon, a famous French cookbook author and wine person, explaining to women in Boston how they should think about pairing food and wine together. And here she's like, drink what you want. And here's a nice here's a nice little coq au vin recipe for you to try. This is another article in October 1962 in which Robert Alden is trying to teach Americans how to think about the wines that they should be tasting. So he says, as another factor, he continued, the wines of Medoc district, for example, were classified in 1855. I should note that that classification has nothing to do with the quality of wine and everything to do with the world exposition that Napoleon III wanted to valorize Bordeaux wines. There have been chateaux where the vineyards have not been cared for as well as they should have been in the last 107 years, and the wines have suffered. At present, the Bordeaux wine region has 33,600 acres of vineyards producing, in a good year, about 6,000 gallons of red wine or 7,000 gallons of white wine. That there is so much production and there are so many different distributors, but also this idea of the constant neglect within Bordeaux and seeking this ideal taste of Bordeaux, even when the weather and the ground don't always cooperate. So one of the things I'm trying to think a lot about is, and trying to track, and this is sort of my first crack at it in the post-war period, of what makes a good wine. You know, what's the volume of wine? The less volume, often the higher concentrate, and often the better the wine. So in 55, it was a very small, I don't quite know what the weather is, so I'm looking at other sources to help fill some of these details in. But 55 was a century wine in which they thought that it was the best and exceptional and an amazing vintage. But, you know, we get to 1955 and what I'm reading, it says it's okay. I haven't figured out the weather yet. 61 was terrible, cold and rainy and not much. 62 was pretty mediocre, but they got a lot. So, you know, how do you manage what the taste is year to year, and how do the varietal characteristics play in? 63 through 65 was an absolute nightmare. There's basically no wine. Each year it was awful. Each year you got very little, and the wine you got was astringent and acidic. You know, 1970 was, they call it a perfect vineyard, a perfect vintage. It was large, so it refilled the previous vintages when there was not much there, but it was also a very good wine. 71 was terrible, even though they got a fair amount. And then 72, they talked about as being hard and acidic. So I'm working through between wine connoisseurs and other data to try to figure out, you know, so how is this being framed? This is something from the CEBV looking at temperature. So if you look at Bordeaux, Bordeaux has a low of about 14 degrees. This comes from about 1962 to a high of about 19 and a half degrees, and then sort of goes back down in September. So this is essentially the growing season. And I have a lot more, I can talk about that in the Q&A if you want to understand growing seasons. But here the Bordelaise are comparing themselves to the other wine districts in Burgundy, in Loire, in Savoie, and in the Midi. To give you a sense of a difference, and here I'll focus just on the first two comparisons between Bordeaux and Napa, both great Cabernet areas to talk about. But as you can see, Napa has more heat than Bordeaux does. And so because there's more heat in Napa, it produces more sugar. It's much easier to vinify those wines. And wines need an acid sugar balance, which you get through cool evenings and warm days. And so California is in a sweet spot of that balance, whereas it's much more difficult for Bordeaux to actually be able to manage these temperatures and the productions. So 1976 is an important year, give or take 2 years. In the mid-1970s, the world market explodes, but so does consumerism and understanding how to drink and what to drink. So the Wine Spectator is founded in 1976. Decanter, the Great British Wine Authority, which Stephen Spurrier writes for a very long time, starts in 1978. Robert Parker, whose taste influences global wine production based on what I'll call the Parker palette, which is fruity, low tannin, high fruit, often ready to drink. And then perhaps most importantly, you have the Judgment in Paris, organized by Steven Spurrier, who again is that French Parisian wine shop owner who pits French wines against California. And, again, Robert Parker, who loves his deep, inky, not too tannic, very fruit forward wines, and he also likes a very oaked wine. In other words, he likes New World wines, largely based on California styles. So also at this exact same moment, you have a transition about what Americans want to drink. Americans are some of the richest people in the world, even though they're suffering from the oil shocks of the 1970s. And so everyone is vying for that market. So earlier in the century, just after Prohibition, you can see that sweet wines outnumber dry wines in the United States by a fair bit. But starting at this exact same moment when California comes on the scene and Bordeaux is slightly faltering, you have a transition to dry wines. Here, I want to look briefly at the vineyard. So one of the things you can look at is you can see that the vines are about 6 feet high. They are spaced widely. They are able to have more, draw more water from the soil. They are not quite as stressed, so they're producing more. And this is from 1979. This is from 1981, which again shows us a landscape of tall vines, wide spaces between them, but also shows us that the wine production could be higher. These are other spaces where people are growing largely wheat and other agricultural commodities. By the 2000s, 1990s, 2000s, after the second phylloxera epidemic, we see something slightly different. Here we see people, this is a hill, so people are bending over, the vines are shorter, and they're much more densely packed together, putting more stress on the wine and ultimately, hopefully, creating more intense wines. This is a picture I took on my trip in October. Here, the vines are spaced a meter apart. They're even shorter than that other vine. So that is likely a left bank wine. This is right bank Merlot. On this, you can see the vines of shattered Merlot as compared to what was happening earlier in 1979. So we're back to Steven Spurrier in 1996, and he's very complaining about AOC and talking about how even the French can't actually tell the difference between their own wine and New World wines. And he says, what surprises is the tardiness in accepting that the rules don't work, that many French wines have lost their originality and hence their identity, or what I'll call the Parker palate. The crisis of identity across the board in France cannot simply be blamed on the laxity of INAO, which is the organization that controls the local attributions of AOC. Its origin lies in the destruction of the soil by intensive use of chemicals and clonal selection, the use of fabricated yeast and overplanting of some varietals and reliance on oak, on unripe or overcrop grapes, over-resilience on technology, all culminating in general yet surprisingly profitable lowering of standards. Spurrier was not a fan of the Parker palate. He envisioned wines that where the terroir and the knowledge and the grape itself led to the taste of what fine Bordeaux ought to be. Norm Robbie, also a decanter writer who focused on the United States, talks again same issue in 1996, talking about the branding of wine and how varietals have become far more prominent at the expense of blends like Bordeaux. He talks about an exciting new brand, Vineyard, which bills itself as offering French varietals with a California style. Again, the Parker palate. I found both the Syrah and Merlot to offer excellent value. The sex of Fortran, another exporter from France in North America, has not been lost on South American producers. So again, an example of where Chardonnay, Cabernet, Merlot, and Pinot Noir are being picked up across the globe by producers in order to sell a very distinct, sorry, I'm one too soon, a very distinct style of wine. So Sideways comes out in 1994. I'm not sure if you've seen it. It's a very sad tale about two guys who go wine tasting in the San Ynez, sort of a Monterey area south of San Francisco. So in one scene, Miles, the guy pouring the spit bucket over his head, which is one of the most disgusting things I've seen in cinema, he says, if anyone orders Merlot, I'm leaving. I'm not drinking any fucking Merlot, which is a grape that had been taking over from Cabernet Sauvignon in Bordeaux. And this is CIBV data created by Gregory Gambetta, who's a professor at the University of Bordeaux, on Jane Anson's website, looking at, even though Merlot hasn't been the favored grape, Pinot Noir, after Sideways, Merlot production went down by about 6%. Pinot Noir purchases went up by about 5%. What we see in this 2000 to 2020, and I'm trying to get the earlier data, is a shift. So Cabernet Sauvignon is going down, Merlot is going up, but the problem is the climate. And in my oral histories with producers that I've been speaking with around Bordeaux, is everyone tells me Merlot is dead because the temperatures and the delicateness of the grape is making it almost impossible to produce. And so one of the questions I'm thinking very deeply about is, what does it mean to be Bordeaux wine? What does this idea of Bordeaux is a fixed in time, something set in the Middle Ages, in which climate and temperature and grape variety and planting densities and the geography and spatial distributions of these grapes matters more than the stories that Bordeaux wants to tell. And so starting in about 2010, there's been a great rejection of Robert Parker. He's old, his eyes are baggy. In 2025, he can't tell the difference between French and California wines. And so a new style of wine, which is less oaky, lets the grape, as wine producers tell me, let the grape speak for itself. Don't put it in oak barrels. Use natural wines to create a new style of Bordeaux. And so thinking about how these things are not set, and as people's taste changes, so does the value of the wines. Thank you.
Thank you very much.